The year was 1931, and the far reaches of the Canadian Arctic were a world defined by a boring and absolute whiteness. The SS Baychimo, a massive 1,300-ton steel-hulled steamship, cut a lonely figure against the vast, jagged horizon of the Beaufort Sea. Owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, she was a sturdy vessel, built to withstand the rhythmic crushing of the polar ice. But as she plowed through the dark, freezing waters near the town of Barrow, Alaska, a spectral change was felt in the air. The Arctic silence began to descend, a heavy, sound-absorbing blanket of frost that signaled the early arrival of a brutal winter. The sound that defined this journey was the rhythmic churn of the steam engine, a steady thump-thump, thump-thump that echoed against the towering walls of blue-tinted icebergs. For the crew, life aboard was a cycle of boring routines, checking the boilers, scrubbing the iron decks, and staring out at a landscape that refused to change. The sea was not liquid here. It was a sluggish slush, a mixture of salt and ice that hissed against the steel hull with a constant sand-like friction. The promise of the Arctic was of isolation, and the Baychimo was its most solitary inhabitant. The architecture of the ice. On the 1st of October, the rhythmic progress of the ship came to a sudden, jarring halt. The ice, driven by a silent and invisible current, closed in around the hull like a giant, frozen vise. There was no loud crash. Instead, there was a boring and deep groan of steel meeting ice, a slow, agonizing sound of pressure. The Baychimo was no longer a moving vessel. She had become a part of the architecture of the ice, a steel island trapped in a desert of frozen ridges. The crew looked out from the bridge and saw a world that had lost all its color. The sky was a dull pewter, and the ice was a monochrome white, stretching out until it blurred into the horizon. The symphony of mist here was cold and biting, carrying the scent of ancient snow and frozen salt. The ship sat in a stagnant stillness, the only motion being the rhythmic plumes of steam rising from her funnels, disappearing almost instantly into the freezing air. It was the beginning of a long, silent wait, a temporal freeze where minutes felt like hours, and the sun barely grazed the edge of the world. The rhythmic breath of the polar wind. As the days turned into a freezing week, the crew's life became an exercise in boring endurance. They built small shelters on the ice nearby, using the ship as a fortress, but fearing its eventual crushing. The sound of the wind was a low-frequency howl, a rhythmic and mournful sound that moved through the ship's rigging like a ghost playing a stringed instrument. Every night, the spectral glow of the northern lights would dance above the masts, shimmering curtains of green and violet that moved with a silent, rhythmic grace, casting long, distorted shadows across the frozen deck. The Baychimo breathed with the ice. When the tide shifted, the ice would sigh and shudder, and the ship would tilt slightly, her steel plates creaking in a boring, repetitive cycle. The crew became accustomed to the rhythmic thumping of ice blocks hitting the hull, a sound that reminded them that the sea was still alive beneath the frozen surface. They were caught in the frozen grip of a land that did not want them there, a place where time was measured not by clocks, but by the slow thickening of the ice around their home. The steel giant's first disappearance. A massive blizzard struck on the night of November 24th. The wind was no longer a whisper. It was a rhythmic roar that blinded the eyes and stole the breath. For 2 days, the crew huddled in their shelters on the ice, unable to see more than a few feet in front of them. When the storm finally subsided and the boring whiteness returned to a calm gray, they stepped outside and gasped. The spot where the massive 1,300-ton steel giant had been trapped was empty. The SS Baychimo was gone. There were no fragments of steel, no oil slicks, no debris. The Arctic silence had reclaimed the space. The crew assumed she had crushed and sunk to the bottom of the Beaufort Sea during the height of the storm, but as they stood in the rhythmic chill of the morning air, they couldn't know that the Baychimo hadn't sunk. She had simply slipped her chains. The steel giant had begun her second life, not as a cargo ship, but as a ghostly specter of the North, beginning a journey that would last for nearly 40 years. When the blizzard of November 1931 finally exhausted itself, it left behind a world that felt fundamentally altered. The crew of the SS Baychimo, huddled in their makeshift shelters on the ice, emerged to find a vast, boring expanse of white where their massive steel home had once stood. The captain and his men initially believed the sea had claimed her, that the rhythmic crushing of the ice had finally breached her hull. But days later, an Inuit hunter brought word. The ship was not at the bottom of the ocean. She was drifting miles away, a steel ghost moving through the symphony of mist. The crew managed to track her down, but the sight that greeted them was one of profound desolation. The Baychimo sat tilted in a new ice floe, her decks covered in a thick, spectral glaze of frozen sea spray. The decision was made to salvage the most valuable furs and abandon the ship for good, as the winter was now too deep and the ship too damaged to trust. As the last man climbed down the rope ladder, leaving the abandoned deck, he left behind a silence that would last for decades, a boring and heavy stillness that transformed a working vessel into a floating tomb of memories. The architecture of desertion. To look upon the Baychimo after the crew had gone inland was to witness the architecture of desertion. The ship's funnels, once exhaling rhythmic plumes of coal smoke, were now cold and choked with frost. The bridge, where the captain had spent countless hours navigating the frozen labyrinth, was now a room of shadows and ice-crusted glass. The wheel stood frozen in place, a burrow of solitude that no human hand would touch for years. The sound of the abandoned ship was a rhythmic groan. Without the warmth of the engines, the metal contracted in the sub-zero temperatures. The steel plates would pop and snap like a distant gunshot, echoing through the empty corridors. The rhythmic clink-clink of a loose chain hitting the side of the hull was the only pulse left in the great steel giant. It was a boring and repetitive sound, a mechanical heartbeat that refused to stop even though the life within had vanished. As the crew moved toward the safety of the inland settlements, they carried with them the echoes of the ship. They remembered the rhythmic clatter of metal plates in the galley and the low, boring murmur of men talking in their bunks. But back on the Baychimo, those sounds were replaced by the whisper of the polar wind. The wind moved through the open hatches and down into the hold, creating a haunting flute-like resonance. The cargo that remained, the heavy crates of supplies and the less valuable furs, sat in the dark, rhythmic shadows of the lower decks. These objects, once vital for survival, were now just spectral remnants. The ship had become a temporal capsule,
drifting at the mercy of the Arctic currents. The absence of the crew created a vacuum of purpose, turning the Baychimo into a boring and aimless wanderer of the north. She was no longer a tool of commerce, she was a specter of the sea, an echo of human ambition left to freeze in the iron grip of the Arctic. The rhythmic drift of a ghost. For the first few months of her abandonment, the Baychimo stayed relatively close to the shore, as if tethered by the lingering memories of her crew. But the Arctic is a place of incessant motion. The ice floes, driven by the rhythmic tides and the boring persistence of the wind, began to carry her further into the unmapped void. The ship's movement was a slow and rhythmic waltz with the icebergs. She would disappear behind a wall of white, only to reappear weeks later, miles away, her black hull a stark contrast to the blinding light of the midnight sun. The abandoned deck became a perch for snowy owls and a resting place for polar bears, the new, silent crew of the Baychimo. They moved across the frozen wood with a rhythmic stealth, their soft footfalls the only sound in a world of spectral whiteness. The Baychimo had begun her long, boring journey into legend, a message from the past that was no longer. As the winter of 1932 deepened, the SS Baychimo ceased to be a ship and became a ghost. She was no longer bound by the schedules of the Hudson's Bay Company or the needs of a human crew. She had entered a state of temporal fluidity, appearing and disappearing along the jagged coastline like a phantom. One week, she would be seen by Inuit hunters, trapped firmly in a field of pack ice. The next, a sudden shift in the currents would cause the vanishing hull to slip away into the symphony of mist, leaving only an empty horizon behind. She was a steel giant playing a boring and repetitive game of hide and seek with the world. The sound that accompanied her travels was the rhythmic crackle of the atmosphere. In the high latitudes, the air is so cold and dry that it carries sound with a spectral clarity. The ship didn't just drift, she moved with a heavy metallic sigh, her hull vibrating against the ice with a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate with the very earth. But it was during the long, boring nights of the polar winter that the Baychimo found her most beautiful and terrifying companion, the Northern Lights. The architecture of the aurora. Above the silent, ice-crusted decks, the sky would erupt in a symphony of green and violet. The aurora borealis moved with a silent, rhythmic pulse, casting an otherworldly glow onto the black steel of the Baychimo. The ship became an architecture of light and shadow. The green ribbons of the aurora would reflect off the frozen funnels and the jagged ice piled against the hull, making the ship appear as if she were made of emerald glass rather than iron. For anyone watching from the shore, the sight was a study in the surreal. The Baychimo would appear as a dark monolith dancing amidst the shimmering curtains of light. The boring and repetitive movement of the aurora, folding and unfolding and drifting, mirrored the ship's own aimless journey. There was no wind to carry the sound of the lights, yet the air felt thick with a static tension, a rhythmic buzzing that made the hair on the back of a neck stand up. The ship was no longer a machine. She was a celestial vessel, caught in the dance between the frozen sea and the electric sky. The Vanishing Act. The most mysterious aspect of the Baychimo was her ability to vanish in plain sight. A boring morning would reveal the ship sitting perfectly still a mile offshore, but as the silver mist rolled in from the open water, the hull would begin to soften and fade. This was the geometry of the mirage. The cold air layers would often bend the light, creating a spectral projection of the ship in the sky, or making her appear much closer than she actually was. By the time the mist cleared, the Baychimo would be gone. She hadn't sunk, she had simply been carried away by the invisible hand of the deep-sea currents. The vanishing hull was a message of impermanence. It taught the observers that in the Arctic, nothing, not even 1,000 tons of steel, is permanent. The ship was a boring reminder of the fragility of man's creations when faced with the rhythmic persistence of nature. Each time she vanished, she left behind a vibrant emptiness, a space in the world that felt heavier for her absence. The rhythmic solitude of the night. In the months of total darkness, the Baychimo lived in a world of acoustic isolation. Without the sun to provide a reference point, the ship's journey became a boring and circular path. The only rhythm was the creak and groan of the hull as it expanded and contracted in the fluctuating cold. The northern lights remained her only constant observers, their spectral fingers reaching down to touch the cold, abandoned bridge. The solitude was absolute. The boring passage of time was only marked by the shifting of the stars and the rhythmic accumulation of frost on the railings. The Baychimo was dancing with the northern lights in a private ballroom of ice, a ghost ship that had found its true purpose, to be a silent sentinel in a land that never sleeps yet never speaks. As the first light of spring began to touch the horizon, the Baychimo was seen again, hundreds of miles from where she had started, her hull scarred but her spirit unbroken.
The story of the SS Baychimo did not end with the winter of 1932. Instead, it stretched into a boring and legendary timeline that spanned nearly 4 decades. For 38 years, the ship became a permanent fixture of the Arctic's silver mist. She was no longer a vessel of commerce, but a nomad of the north, appearing to sailors, Inuit hunters, and explorers when they least expected it. These were the decades of sightings, a period where the ship became a temporal echo, a rhythmic reminder of a past that refused to be buried by the ice or the sea. The sound that defined these years was the rhythmic lap of freezing water against a rusted hull. Whenever the Baychimo was spotted, she was often described as moving with a ghostly fluidity. She would emerge from a wall of fog, her black paint faded to a spectral gray, her masts skeletal and bare against the horizon. For the observers, the sight was always accompanied by a heavy, boring stillness. The wind seemed to die down in her presence, leaving only the muted thud of the ship hitting small ice floes as she drifted aimlessly through the Beaufort Sea. The architecture of a legend. As the decades passed, the 1930s, the 40s, the 50s, and into the 60s, the Baychimo underwent a metamorphosis of decay. She was an architecture of resilience. Despite being abandoned and crushed by ice dozens of times, the steel giant remained upright. In 1933, a group of Inuit managed to board her during a storm, trapped on the ship for 10 days as she drifted through the boring and cold dark. They reported that the interior was a museum of the frozen, where the rhythmic clink of a loose door handle and the boring smell of old wool and old oil still lingered in the air. The sightings became a rhythmic calendar for the Arctic. In 1939, a captain spotted her and attempted to board, but the silver mist closed in and the ship slipped away before the lines could be thrown.
In 1962, a group of Inuit saw her again, drifting calmly in the Chukchi Sea. Every sighting was the same. The ship looked boringly peaceful, as if she were merely waiting for a crew that would never return. She had become a spectral landmark, a point of reference in a landscape that was otherwise constantly shifting. The rhythmic persistence of the Specter. Why did the Baychimo stay afloat for so long? It was a boring mystery of physics and luck. The Arctic ice, which usually destroys ships, seemed to act as a protective cradle for her. She would be lifted out of the water by the pressure, her hull resting on a rhythmic bed of ice, only to be lowered back into the sea when the thaw came. This cycle of capture and release was the ship's new heartbeat. The silver mist acted as her shroud. In the Arctic, the mist is not just weather, it is a spatial distortion. It muffles the sound of the waves and creates a boring and infinite gray room. Inside this room, the Baychimo was the only solid object. Sailors who caught a glimpse of her often felt a rhythmic sense of dread, not because she was a ghost ship, but because she represented the boring power of time. She was a clock that had stopped, yet continued to move across the map. She was the eternal passenger of the Arctic currents, a message from 1931 still being delivered in 1969. The last echo in the mist. The final recorded sighting occurred in 1969, 38 years after she was first abandoned. An Inuit group found her once again, stuck fast in a large ice floe in the Beaufort Sea. She was rusted, her deck plates warped by nearly 4 decades of boring and brutal winters, but she was still there. She sat in the rhythmic silence of the polar evening, a dark monolith against the pale ice. They did not try to board her. They simply watched as the silver mist began to rise from the open lead of water. The ship began to fade, her outlines softening into the gray, until only the rhythmic creak of her hull could be heard. It was the last time the Baychimo would be seen by human eyes. She had completed her decades of sightings, transitioning from a physical object into a pure legend. She drifted back into the heart of the mist, carrying the river's secret of the Arctic with her, leaving the world to wonder if she is still out there, a boring and eternal ghost dancing in the silent, frozen dark.
After the final recorded sighting in 1969, a new kind of silence settled over the legend of the SS Baychimo. It was no longer the silence of a ship waiting to be found, but the absolute stillness of a mystery that had finally transitioned into the realm of myth. The steel giant, after 38 years of defiant wandering, began her final drift. She moved away from the sight of men, away from the Inuit hunting grounds, and toward the vast, empty center of the Beaufort Sea, a place where the rhythmic grinding of the polar ice pack is the only sound heard for 1,000 miles. The atmosphere of this final journey was one of boring and eternal peace. The Baychimo was no longer a ghost ship in the eyes of the world. She had become a part of the Arctic's natural cycle. Her rusted hull, now a deep spectral red, harmonized with the dark blues of the deep water and the blinding whites of the ice. The sound that followed her was the rhythmic sigh of the abyss, the low, vibrating moan of the ocean floor, and the soft, boring hiss of snow falling into open leads of water. She was drifting toward her final resting place,
a destination known only to the currents. The architecture of the unknown. What happened to the Baychimo after 1969? There are no records, only the architecture of speculation. Perhaps the rhythmic pressure of a particularly brutal winter finally proved too much for her weary steel plates. In the boring and repetitive dark of a polar night, the ice may have offered a final, crushing embrace. The sound would have been a slow, resonant boom, a metallic farewell that echoed across the frozen wastes before being swallowed by the symphony of mist. If she sank, her descent would have been a rhythmic plunge into the unknown depths. She would have drifted down through the layers of freezing water, past the spectral glow of bioluminescent creatures, until she touched the soft, silty floor of the Beaufort Sea. There she would sit in perpetual darkness, a steel cathedral at the bottom of the world. The boring passage of centuries would see her covered in a rhythmic layer of sediment, turning the ship a reef of iron and memory, a silent monument to the year 1931. The rhythmic legacy of the ghost. The Baychimo never left the human consciousness. She remains the unsolved chord in the symphony of the North. For the people of the Arctic, she is a boring and steady reminder that the sea can never be fully conquered. The rhythmic pulse of her story continues to beat in the hearts of those who look out at the silver mist and wonder if just beyond the horizon a black hull is still cutting through the slush. The ship's legacy is one of endurance without purpose. It didn't stay afloat to save anyone or to deliver cargo. It stayed afloat simply because it could. This boring persistence is what makes her story so peaceful. It is a story that doesn't demand an ending. The final drift is not a tragedy. It is a rhythmic resolution. Whether she is still drifting in some uncharted, ice-locked corner of the pole or resting in the unknown depths, the Baychimo has achieved a state of eternal stillness. The symphony's final note. As the silver mist rolls over the Beaufort Sea tonight, the symphony of the Arctic continues. The ice still creaks and groans in a rhythmic cycle of freezing and thawing. The wind still whispers through the empty spaces where the Baychimo once sailed. The mystery of the ship is the boring and beautiful soundtrack to the North, a story that helps the world sleep because it reminds us that some secrets are meant to be kept by the sea. The SS Baychimo has found her peace. The rhythmic clink of her chains and the boring hum of her engine are gone, replaced by the eternal lullaby of the deep. As we close the book on her journey, we are left with a sense of spectral calm. The ghost ship of the Arctic has finally vanished into the unknown depths, leaving behind nothing but the rhythmic echo of a steel giant that refused to sink and a mystery that will never